Well, in the last century, a number of prisoner exchanges have taken place either to de escalate rising tension between countries or to facilitate some peace negotiation or maybe aid diplomatic relations. Sometimes the only incentive is to attempt to save some prisoner's life. In 2006, an Israeli soldier was captured by Hamas and held for more than 5 years. His capture became a high-profile case, an emotional issue, a national issue. There was an outcry that arose for his release, whatever it might take, and his status was constantly in the news. Eventually, this captured Israeli soldier was exchanged for 1,000 Palestinian soldiers who'd been captured over the years. That exchange sparked global controversy because of the unequal ratio, the potential harm that could come from these released Palestinian soldiers. But Israel remained firm in its response that one Israeli soldier was worth that kind of prisoner exchange. Now, even though that event was headline news nearly every day about 12 years ago, the world has since moved on, and I wonder, does anybody remember now? Well, I can guarantee you somebody does. That one Israeli soldier. He'll never forget the day of his prisoner exchange. I was curious about him now some 12 years, 13 years later, and found that he was living a relatively quiet life out of the public view. According to the news source I researched called ChatGPT, which, by the way, did not write my sermon, he refused any public, any political role. He was sort of a national hero, but he's now married, raising a family in out of the public eye, and he's simply happy to be alive. There's another prisoner exchange that occurred in Israel, and to this day, nobody has forgotten it. In fact, God didn't want us to forget it because he had it recorded in all 4 gospel accounts. It's the prisoner exchange between Barabbas and Jesus. Barabbas is about to become a literal, physical illustration of the gospel. The Apostle Paul writes in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 6 that Jesus gave himself as a ransom. And the word he uses for ransom was the common word in Paul's day, the standard word used for money that was paid to have a prisoner of war released. Well, we're going to see that play out in the Bible as we study it today. You can take your Bibles and turn to Luke's gospel. I'll put scriptures up on the screen because we'll go between the gospel accounts. But in order to set the stage for this prisoner exchange, remember, if you were with us a couple of weeks ago, we watched Pilate sort of work himself into a political jam. We noted from history that Pilate was under observation by the Roman emperor by this time for his inability to rule over this unsettled land. And he'd caused too much political unrest. None of that went over very well with the emperor. Because of that, Pilate knows that he cannot afford another riot on his hands. But at the same time, he sees through these hypocritical religious leaders and their accusations of Jesus. He knows it's all bogus. In fact, he's already said 3 times in the accounts that Jesus was innocent. He wasn't guilty of any of these charges. Matthew's gospel, however, informs us that Pilate knew, quote, that it was out of envy that they, the religious leaders, had delivered him up. He saw through it. He knew they were trying to get rid of a religious rival. It had nothing to do with the law. This was unjust from top to bottom. Then we noted that Pilate's wife even got involved. She sent him a note. She knows he's involved in this political opposition, but she says, look, I've had a dream about Jesus, and whatever you do, let him go. He's a righteous man. In other words, he's innocent. So he's trying everything. He can't afford to have this unrest go any further and have that show up on his performance review. So with that as a backdrop, Pilate comes up with a stroke of genius. He happens to be holding a Jewish criminal who's been a burr in Rome's side for quite a while. John's gospel referred to him as a robber. The word used by John in chapter 18, verse 40, actually refers to a dangerous robber or dangerous criminal. If this were today, his little photo would be tacked up at the post office on that little bulletin board, and underneath would be the words, armed and dangerous. Mark's gospel simply called him a murderer. So Barabbas is not some, petty thief, some pickpocket. He's killing people in order to have his way. Now, at Luke's account, look at chapter 23 and verse 19. He describes him as a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. Now, this is an important description because it not only tells us that Barabbas was guilty of murder, it informs us here of who he's murdering. He's a member of an ever-present threat to the Roman government. He's an overzealous Jew who was involved at this point in guerrilla warfare, assassination, hand-to-hand combat. He's doing everything he can to remove Rome from the land of Israel. Now add to that the fact that Matthew's gospel calls him a notorious prisoner. The word notorious means in the English language marked. We would say he was a marked man. He had a price, as it were, on his head. He was a fugitive marked by the government, and they were looking for him. They've been searching for him and for members of his gang. And they finally caught him and two other men who were his partners. Now, I do want to add this as well. I know this is a lot of background. You'll get out before dinner tonight, so just relax. This isn't just a problem with Pilate. This is a problem with the Jewish Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership. They don't want trouble in Palestine. They don't want trouble with Rome. As we've already learned, the office of high priest was bought from the Roman government. It was a corrupt office. And the Roman governor would give it to whomever would keep the peace, keep him out of trouble, and Rome would leave the Jews alone, and the Jews would leave Rome alone. So I say all of that to tell you that as far as Rome is concerned, and as far as the Jewish leadership is concerned, Barabbas is the last guy they want back out on the street. This is Pilate's stroke of genius, but it's going to backfire on him. It's Passover season, and he remembers this unique tradition. Now, Matthew chapter 27, I'm going to read at verse 15. Now at the feast, that is the Passover, the governor, that would be Pilate, was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they, the crowd, the Jewish people, wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ? And he's expecting them to say, okay, give us Jesus. We don't want that killer back on the street. This custom, by the way, goes all the way back to the book of Exodus, to the original Passover, when the Israelites were released from their captivity in Egypt. a tradition that illustrated the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, the innocent lamb who gives his life for the freedom of those who are guilty, those in prison. So as a way of remembering their release from bondage in Egypt, on every Passover season since, the nation Israel would illustrate this physically, tangibly, by letting some prisoner go free. Some guilty man goes free. Now, look, you can imagine, probably the Sanhedrin made the choice. In fact, they told the crowd here who to choose. That they would come up with a name of some small-time offender, right? Some pickpocket, some first-time offender, some guy who's going to promise never to cause trouble again in order to be set free. Okay, I promise no more threat to society in whatever way, I'll go straight. That's not Barabbas. He's public enemy number one. He's guilty of treason and theft and insurrection and murder and who knows what else. And the Roman government has finally caught him. Mark's gospel informs us that Barabbas had been imprisoned with some other men who had also been involved with him in committing murder in their rebellion against Rome. As one commentator pointed out, this verifies that the two other individuals who be crucified on either side of Jesus were partners in crime with Barabbas, which also confirms that that middle cross from which Jesus will hang was intended for Barabbas. Jesus will literally and physically take his place. This is the gospel. Now, let's take just a closer look at Barabbas. First of all, you need to know that Barabbas isn't really a name. It's more like a nickname, what we might call a street name. You could call this his popular name. It's been picked up by the public over time, who, by the way, I believe would have admired him, though secretly. He was sort of a first century Robin Hood. He's risking his life. He's fighting the government in order to, save Israel. And every time a news bulletin appeared of some sort that, another Roman soldier is dead at the hand of Barabbas, they would have all just sort of secretly, behind closed doors, been very grateful, applauded it. This nickname, Barabbas, is an Aramaic term that referred to his father. The first part of the name is Bar. You might be old enough in the faith to know that Bar means son. And then the last part of the name would indicate the name of the father. That would be the tradition in these days. You might remember that Jesus referred to Simon Peter as Simon Bar Jonah. That is, Simon, the son of Jonah or John. If we followed that custom today, your name like mine would probably be rather long, especially if you stuck in the middle name. Mine would be Stephen, Dwayne, Bar, Keith. A lot to learn how to write. Kindergarten would have been really tough if this were the condition today. But for Barabbas, Bar means son, but Abba or Abbas means father. The son of a father is strange. It's a strange nickname. William Barclay pulls from history the fact that during the first and second centuries, a custom developed where the most well-known, the most well-respected rabbis were referred to as abbas. Sort of like the Apostle John. If you've read his last three little letters, little postcards before you get to his Apocalypse, Revelation, he simply refers to himself as the old man, the elder. And so he signs his letters that way, the elder, to, and then to whom the letter's written. Everybody knew by then this 95-year-old man, this is a beloved term, the elder. That's what he went by. Well, everybody knew Barabbas was the son of a famous rabbi. We don't know who. but they did. And since everybody knew who the rabbi was, Barabbas was simply known as that famous rabbi's son. We would call him today the preacher's kid. Barabbas had grown up in the home of a rabbi. That means he grew up in the home of a Bible teacher, a preacher, an expositor of the Old Testament law. Now, how faithful his father had been to the law, we don't know. But we do know that somewhere along the way, Barabbas is going to reject his father's teaching that he'd grown up under, and he's going to turn to this life of crime. He's going to become a murderer, a leader among a gang of men who now have Roman blood on their hands. Now, we still don't know his first name. Syriac and Armenian manuscripts help us, ancient manuscripts that'll later be ignored. Grant Osborne, in his exegetical commentary on this passage, writes that Barabbas' first name was most likely dropped rather quickly from any reference in manuscripts or church tradition, primarily out of reverence for the name of the Lord, and that's because Barabbas' first name was Jesus. Yeshua. It's a counterpart to the Old Testament name Joshua. Means deliverer. Now, you got to understand, a lot of little boys running around these streets were named, Jesus. It's still popular in other countries. I'm watching, the World Series, and every so often Jesus steps up to bat, and I'm thinking he ain't going to strike out, and he strikes out. It just, devastates me. But it would be the desire of any Jewish couple to have a son that grows up to be a deliverer, to be like Joshua, that valiant soldier of old. How great would that be? This rabbi and his wife, so they have a little boy. They confer like you might have done. Which names go best with your last name or whatever, what was uncle, whatever. They decide, let's name him Yeshua. Maybe he'll grow up to be a man of godly standing, a patriot who loves his nation, but loves most of all God. Ken Hughes writes in his commentary that the church father Origen, writing in the late 2nd century, said very clearly that this criminal leader's name was Iesus, that's Greek, Jesus Barabbas. So the irony here becomes deeper. Here's a boy who grows up in a home where his father is becoming a famous rabbi, and he does grow up loyal to his nation. But as he ages, you can only imagine, as I have tried to, the heated debates around the kitchen table. As Yeshua grows up, he becomes more and more disillusioned with his father's passive status quo position as a religious leader. All about peaceful coexistence with Rome. And I can hear Barabbas saying, yeah, but what about the injustice of Rome? What about the murder of innocent Jewish citizens by Pilate's own decree while they were celebrating in the temple? What about his theft of treasury money to build that aqueduct? What about that? What about Israel's subjugation to the Roman Empire? I could just hear them debating. At some point, Barabbas begins to live out the meaning of his name, but in a violent manner. I wonder about his relationship with his mother and his father. But he would think, isn't it time for another Joshua, another deliverer to arise in the land? I mean, He says in his mind, I'm going to be that kind of deliverer. In fact, this is the kind of messianic figure the nation needs. right now. So Pilate thinks he's got himself out of a mess. And this is why he makes this careful distinction, by the way, in Matthew's account of chapter 27 and verse 17. Follow this. Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ? One Syriac manuscript reads, whom do you want me to release to you, Yeshua Barabbas or Yeshua Christ? Do you want Jesus, the son of a rabbi, or Jesus, the Son of God? That's how we read it. This is, frankly, beloved, one of the most stunning, ironic, staggering prisoner exchanges in human history. And of course, the crowd, to the surprise, no doubt, of Pilate, shouts for Barabbas to be released. And it made me think, why were they so quickly converted? Well, Barabbas is the kind of Messiah they were hoping for. They want a Messiah who's willing to kill, not who's willing to die. What good is that? And that same decision, by the way, is being made to this day in 1,000 different ways. They all spell the same thing. We want a Messiah who will give us what we want. We want a Messiah who will let us live the way we want. We want a Messiah that'll leave us alone for the most part, except maybe, a couple hours a year on holidays. We don't want a Jesus who died for our sins. That means we have to admit that we've sinned. We're sinners. We don't want a Jesus who is judged in our place. That implies that we think we're guilty of God's judgment. We don't want a Jesus who will make life more difficult for us. We want a Jesus who will make life more comfortable for us. We don't want a Jesus who thinks he can direct our lives and tell us what we can't do and tell us what we can do. We don't want that Jesus. I've heard those answers in some way, shape, or form for many years. Well, now he's facing a potential riot. The crowd is steaming, unable to get him off the hook. He makes this prisoner exchange. Luke records it in chapter 23, verse 23, but they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified. And their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. One account informs us that he will then call for a basin of water and wash his hands and say, I'm not guilty. And we use that expression, we're going to wash our hands of it to this day. We're not given any details of Barabbas' release from his cell. He's there nearby in the fortress of Antonia. He would have heard the crowd chanting his name, but he wouldn't have known why. Several authors pointed out this interesting dynamic. Barabbas wouldn't have been able to hear what Pilate was saying to the crowd, whom do you want me to release? But he would have heard them shouting his name, Barabbas. Then he wouldn't have heard Pilate ask, what do you want me to do with Jesus the Christ? But they would have heard the mob shout, but he would have heard the mob shouting, crucify him. Barabbas, crucify him. That's all he would have heard. And how his heart would begin to pound with fear. So imagine the next thing he hears are the footsteps of Roman soldiers on the stone corridor coming toward him. Perhaps a key turns in a lock, opens a door near him, and he hears his two friends being pulled out and then another key in the lock in his cell door, and he's in there, and he would be thinking, this is it. I'm going to die. My life has been in vain. But the warden stands there and says to him, get up. You've been part of a prisoner exchange. That other Jesus is going to die in your place. You're free. Now get out. Wouldn't you like to know what Barabbas did with the rest of his life? I do. I looked it up. ChatGPT didn't help one bit on this. But I do believe this. He evidently stopped what he was doing, lived a relatively quiet, private life. And the reason I believe that is because nothing surfaces after this about him in history, in church tradition, in early church fathers' writings. No mention of him in the Word. Absolutely nothing. And it made me think perhaps it's because God evidently wanted the biographical entry of Barabbas to simply end with this stunning fact. Jesus took his place. Just like he took your place and mine. There was a prisoner exchange. Barabbas lived. Jesus died. I can't help but hold up the mirror of the Word and see here that we can be a lot like Pilate. We move along by the current of the voices. We have seen compromise in our community, in our nation, based on the voices of the crowd, the majority opinion. Pilate was more interested in protecting himself, his reputation, his power, that he condemns an innocent man and lets a murderer go free. I think we're like these people. We are tuned in to that majority opinion much more than we should be. We're like the religious leaders. They were offended from day one that Jesus would dare discomfort them. Challenge their way of life. But we are most like Barabbas, aren't we? Guilty, incarcerated to this body of flesh. Paul writes, confined to a sinful heart and mind that just adds to the mountain of sin. Hopeless before the holy discernment of God, his omniscience who knows every thought and deed, his omnipresence, which means he's an eyewitness to it all, and he's written it all in the books that will be opened when he judges all of humanity. Every deed, every thought, every plan, every wish, every sin. We deserve justice. But a key turns in the cell door of our lives, and Jesus Christ stands there, and he offers a prisoner exchange, and he says to you, my life for yours. My sacrifice for your sin. My redemption for your admission. that you're a sinner, hopeless, in need of a Savior. And let me ask you, how have you responded to Jesus with this offer? It's still standing. Barabbas could have said to his jailer, I suppose, look, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not going to leave till Pilate apologizes. He needs to come down here and see me. I could imagine Barabbas saying, I really appreciate the offer, but I've sinned too greatly. You don't even know the half of it. You don't know all the people I killed. I deserve to die. I don't deserve to go free. Barabbas could have said, okay, but let me stay in here a few years and pay off some of it. Pay for some of my crimes against society. I have heard that as well. What did Barabbas have to do to go free? Walk out of his cell. The beneficiary of a prisoner exchange. His freedom was paid for by the final Passover lamb who came to die for the sins of the world. That includes you and me. I couldn't help but think of Jesus' first sermon that he preached. We covered it back in Luke chapter 4, where he turned to Isaiah and he applied it to himself. And he said, I have come to set the prisoner free. Here you go. Exhibit A. To this day, his death on the cross, on your cross, my cross, is still setting captives free. Are you free today? Not because you deserved it, you paid for it, you earned it, but because an innocent man died in your place and set you free. I close with this story by M.R. DeHaan. He's the founder of Our Daily Bread Ministries, now with the Lord for many years. But DeHaan was a converted medical doctor, and he loved to tell the story of a man who was known around town as Old Man Klein. He had that name. It was because he was avoided by people, just referred to as Old Man Klein. He was self-centered, unkind. Children would taunt him, and people avoid him. One particular Sunday night, he was walking down the street past the little church whose members had often invited him to attend, and he'd never accepted their invitation. Just turned them down flat. Well, it was a warm summer night in the 1920s, and the windows of this little church building were open, and the congregation was singing, and the music, just kind of floated on the wind and down the sidewalk where Mr. Klein was walking. No one knew it, but he had grown discouraged in life. He was troubled by his shortcomings. He knew he'd not been a good man, a kind man. But more than anything else, he knew that he was without an answer, without a prospect, without hope beyond the grave. He stopped walking as the music just sort of breezed toward him and swirled around him. He couldn't believe his ears, actually. He stopped as he listened, and they were singing about Jesus dying for mankind, and Jesus, the song went, died for me. Well, his hearing wasn't very good at all, so he walked closer to listen. He thought they were actually singing about him. Sure enough, when the congregation came again to the chorus, Jesus died for all mankind, he thought they were singing Jesus died for Old Man Klein. Could it be, he thought? Could it be true? Well, he entered the little chapel and he sat through the message and learned it was true, that Jesus had died for him. He believed. And right then and there trusted Christ. And a prisoner exchange was made that night. Another captive was set free. How about you?